Hello Year 5 and welcome to your English lesson today. So today we're going to be looking at writing a character description using a variety of different clauses. So by the end of the lesson, you need to be able to identify relative pronouns. This is going to be revision for us because we've done this last term. We're going to be able to understand their role within a clause, so why they're important. Be able to then effectively use relative pronouns within clauses. And then you're going to have a go at understanding the order of relative clauses, which we've done before when we know that we can change the main clause and the subordinate clause or a relative clause around in a different order. Once we've done that, we're going to then recap on looking at punctuating embedded clauses properly. So we're going to work through and do some different examples of making sure we've got our commas. And then you guys are going to have a go at them writing a character description. And I'm going to do some modelling and we're going to do some paired work together before you have a go on your own. So, first of all, what is a clause? And we know that a clause is a group of words that includes a subject and a verb. So the person that it's about, or the object or the item it's about, and a doing word. And we have two types of clauses. We have an independent clause and a subordinate clause. Now we also know the independent clause is called a main clause. So the main clause or the independent clause makes sense on its own. Okay, for example, I went to town, it was red. When we look at a subordinate clause, okay, this is an extra sentence that supports that main clause. So the opening words for a subordinate clause show that they're dependent on their own. So they usually start with some form of a conjunction. Now that part of the sentence, if left on its own, does not make sense, okay? But that is all revision for us, so that should be easy to follow. So let's look at relative clauses. So relative pronouns, okay, are used differently to other pronouns. So our other pronouns of he, she, it, they, us, mine, ours, those are different types of pronouns to relative pronouns, okay? So they actually introduce a relative clause, okay? So that sentence, it gives us additional information. So these are our relative pronouns. We have who, which, where, when, whose, and that, okay? So they can relate the clause to the noun or a pronoun. For example, old Deuteronomy, who was sleepy, licked his tail. Now, if I took out that middle section, it would just say, old Deuteronomy licked his tail. But with the example of who was sleepy, we're extending that part because we're now referring to old Deuteronomy. So the who links back to the original pronoun. So, old Deuteronomy licked his tail. So that his is a pronoun for him, his. But our relative pronoun, which, he called towards him. So that which is relating to his tail, which coils around him. And here, old Deuteronomy, whose tongue was very rough, licked his tail. So now we're talking about the tongue belonging to old Deuteronomy. And old Deuteronomy licked the bite. So now we've got the, which is a pronoun, that the mouse had given him. So he'd had a bite, and that the mouse had given him is linking to the bite that he had. Okay, so those are our relative pronouns. So when we now look at relative clauses, okay, they can also relate to a whole clause, and this is where our relative pronouns come into play. So the cat caught the canary, okay, that's our main clause. The cat caught the canary, which annoyed its owner, okay. So it's not the cat which has annoyed the owner, okay, it's the cat catching the canary that has annoyed the owner. So we've given it some additional information, okay? And here we can see we've used the word which is our relative pronoun. So relative clauses can give extra information, which we know. For example, old Deuteronomy was an old cat. So now we can include some extra information. Now we know that sometimes these can be called embedded clauses. We know they're embedded because they're tucked in between our bed and our duvet. So they're tucked in the middle. So we've got our two little commas. Okay, so let's think about something more. So old Deuteronomy was an old cat who lived in the village. Now this isn't an embedded clause, this is just a relative clause because it's on the end of the sentence. But you can see how we've now given it some more information. Old Deuteronomy, who lived in a village, was an old cat. So here we've now used an embedded clause, and what we've done is we've taken that relative clause from the end and we've embedded it in the middle. So we still have exactly the same words and exactly the same sentence, but in a different order. But it's important to remember our commas, okay? And we're going to recap that in a minute. So old Deuteronomy blocked the road, which was inconvenient on market day. Okay, so here we've added that relative clause which relates to the beginning part of our clause, okay? So here we can add the additional relative clause onto the end of these sentences, but remember it's got to link to the subject of our story. So here we're talking about the road, okay, which was an inconvenience. So the blocked road was an inconvenience. Gumby Cat had a bedside chair, which was very handy. So the chair is very handy. Here we're talking about the spicy food that the mice don't want to eat. Here it says old Deuteronomy has had many wives, which shows how old he is. So here we've got a relative clause about him. And here it said he sat in the sun, which meant he was warm and comfortable. So that's linking back to him and the sun. Okay. So here we've got it as a subordinate clause because this part of the sentence does not make sense on its own. Okay. So the main clause is that main part of the sentence. That's the bit that makes sense on its own. And our subordinate clause doesn't make sense on its own. Okay. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to see if you can identify the main clause and relative clause in each sentence. And what noun is that relative clause linking about? So have a look at these ones on the board. Pause the video. Can you work out which bit's the main clause and which bit's the relative clause? Okay, so this bit's the main clause here. And this is the subordinate clause because it starts with a relative pronoun. Okay. Now it says which was warm and comforting. Here we're talking about the sunlight. Okay. Gumby sat on the hat which she had found on the table. So again, our relative pronoun. Now we're talking about she found on the whole table. We must be talking about the hat. So you can see how that subordinate clause gives us additional information about our noun. So it's important to remember when we're punctuating our clauses, okay, that we use a comma. However, when the relative clause comes straight after the main clause, we don't usually need a comma, okay? So old Deuteronomy ignored the noise which was coming towards him. Our relative clause is on the end, okay? Therefore, we do not need that punctuation, okay? Because that break in the sentence is just unnecessary, okay? But sometimes the relative clause is embedded in the main clause, okay? And this is what we've looked at a few times last term. So we have our main clause, the mice ate the cheese, and I want to say a little bit more about them now, okay? So this extra bit of information now needs to be about the mice because we're talking about the mice, okay? So the mice, who were happy to have tasty food, ate the cheese. So now I've embedded that additional information in the middle and I've used a who because my subject is the mice, okay? Now here you can see that is now my subordinate clause. Still have two main clauses, okay? Because that main clause together still makes sense, but I've added my embedded clause in the middle, okay? Now, because it's breaking up that clause, and we've now split it, we have to have our commas now in between because we've got to separate that clause from our main clause. So remember, we have our bed, we have us, and we have our blankie, okay? So imagine you're tucked in nicely into bed. So Gumby slept on the papers, the dog skirted around, and here are some examples. I want you to read these main clauses, okay? What I would like to do now, on your piece of paper in front of you, I would like to rewrite those sentences with an embedded relative clause. Okay, so remember it's got to start with who, where, when, which, those, and that. Okay, remember it's got to be related about the noun, and the noun, okay, is written in bold. So pause the video, I want you to write those sentences and add an embedded clause in the middle. And don't forget to add your punctuation. Okay, so pause the video and have a go. Okay, so here are some of the examples that I came up with. Okay, so here you can see I've added my subordinate clause in the middle, and they're all relative subordinate clauses because they all start with a relative pronoun. Now I'm checking my punctuation. I need to make sure that I have a comma between my main clause and my subordinate clause. So pause the video and just double check that you've used the correct punctuation.